this bill to the House.
I call Carmel Cipollone.
Mr. Speaker, just actually supporting, I think, most of what all of what the last Labor Speaker said, but also most of what the Chair of the Social Services Select Committee, Alfred Ngaro, said as well. This bill does address a really emotive issue in the submission process and the submissions that we received on this bill. We're at times incredibly emotional, and we got them from a range of different people who work with sexual offenders, people who have been convicted of sexual offences, people who have been victims of sexual crimes, and people who work with those victims. And so, Mr. Chair, I think the submission process allowed us to actually explore this area quite thoroughly. And I think we all got to the point where, okay, this is one measure, but as Alfred Ngaro said, it definitely isn't a silver bullet to resolving the issues that the bill seeks to address. So, Mr. Speaker, I need to just say that, you know, one of the things we need to keep in mind here is that this bill the purpose of it is to decrease the chances of reoffending. And the concern that was raised the whole way through considering this bill is that actually we're talking about a very, very small group of people in the scheme of sexual offending. I mean, we're talking about the fact that only 1% of sexual violence cases will actually lead to a conviction. And so we're talking about a very small group of people who have actually been found out for having committed a sexual offence. And the concern when we were discussing this is really that we don't want to give people a sense of false security, that actually somehow their children will be protected because of the fact that we're now going to have better data sharing between government departments. Because in fact, the reality is, and although we all hate to acknowledge this, that the real risk lays with close friends and family who have never been convicted or suspected of a sexual offence. And that is something that we need to ensure that families remember, that it isn't actually the ones who have been convicted that pose the biggest risk. It's the people in our own circles that pose the biggest risk to our children. So we do support this bill with reservations, as has been mentioned before, Mr. Speaker. We support it now because it is much clearer around the fact that this is a register that will be about data sharing between government departments. And as it has been raised earlier, it wouldn't do us any favours if we had a public register, actually, and the research and evidence shows that actually does increase the chances of reoffending, and we don't want that to happen. I know that there's lots of people out there, that the general public, many would think actually they want to know, you know, and that there should be a public register so that they can find out. And of course, you can understand why people would think that. But actually, we have the privilege of getting information, of having the evidence put in front of us, and we have to make the decisions that are best for New Zealanders and actually do protect the people that we're setting out to protect. And that means actually that it shouldn't be a public register. That's the conclusion that the committee got to, and that's definitely what the evidence said that we were presented with. So we are at the point where we agree. It is just a data sharing register between government departments, and that's okay with us. It's just we need to be clear, as Alfred Ngaro said, that this isn't a silver bullet, and it's not going to have very much of an impact at all. There may be a nominal impact, but it will have very little impact with respect to reducing sex offending against children. So we did raise the concern around the false sense of security, so I've spoken about that, but also there were other concerns, and one of them was actually just the sheer amount of money that is going to be put towards this. So we looking at it, the budgets that will have their baselines affected, we've got 70.6 million from corrections, 14.1 million from police, and then 380,000 from courts. So that's $14.1 million, Mr. Speaker. It is a lot of money for something that actually, as I said before, may have a slight impact, but won't really do much in terms of reducing actual sex offending against children. And so we needed to take that into consideration as a committee when we were considering this bill, particularly in light of the fact that it wasn't that long ago where we had the inquiry into the funding of the sexual violence sector. And so many recommendations came out of that in terms of what should be funded, how things should be funded, so that the sector can be more effective and address the needs of the people concerned. And actually, unfortunately, there was very little that came out of that with respect to government action, government taking up the recommendations that came out of the inquiry. And so that's disappointing. It was a missed opportunity, as my colleague Poto Williams has just said. It was a missed opportunity, and we have seen, I think, a slight injection of funding into the sector. 10 million over 4 years, but here we're talking about a database, data sharing register that's actually going to cost $14.1 million a year, Poto's telling me, $146 million over 10 years. Poto Williams is part of this process too, so we're just having a conversation as I do the speech in the House. Talking amongst ourselves. And so $146 million over 10 years is a lot more than the $10 million that we've seen injected over 4 years for actions that actually had been advised on and that we had evidence to support would actually be much more effective than this particular measure. So that's disappointing, Mr. Speaker. I'm not completely disregarding the work that the Select Committee has done on this bill to bring it to this place, because, as I said, we will be supporting it. It is just when you weigh it up with respect to the other actions that could have been implemented and the need for that sector to have a much larger injection of funding, then, of course, you can't help but to think, how do we reconcile these two things a little bit? So that was a concern. So our other concern was that, as the submitters did articulate the need for government to place a higher emphasis on investing in research and evaluation of other means of reducing offending, such as specialist offender treatment, primary preventative education, as well as working with children, young people, families and communities about recognising harmful behaviour. And that all makes sense to us. But there is money required in this sector to ensure that those things can be done better, Mr. Speaker. So I'm going to leave it at that and just say that I actually really appreciated going through this process with the Select Committee. I think that we did a good job considering this bill. We do support it with reservations, and I've explained why. You know, if it does have a slight impact, then even a slight impact with regards to our children and what this is attempting to do is worth something. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.